Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host,
Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is about the Jewish history, or the history of the Jewish community of Metz in France throughout its long history. It started off, the genesis of this episode was that last week I did another Aruch Laner, and I mentioned in passing the Shaagas Aryeh. And I referred to the Shaagas Aryeh because I mentioned his son, Rav Asher Wallerstein, who was named after the father of the Shaagas Aryeh. He was the only son of the Shaagas Aryeh. The Shaagas Aryeh had a daughter and a son. This Rav Asher Wallerstein was the Rebbe of the Aruch Laner, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, who was the subject of last week's episode. And I referred to the Shaagas Aryeh by Rabbi Aryeh Leib Ginsburg. And a very knowledgeable listener, he alerted me to the fact that Ginsburg is an incorrect association. It was made up in the the mistake was made, not made up. The mistake was made in the late 1800s. It was a book written, L'Toldos Mishpachas Ginsburg, and the author assumed that the Shaagas Aryeh's last name, because of a whole thing over there, that his last name was Ginsburg, and it's incorrect. It was disproven in a scholarly article written in the Yerusha Seinu, whatever it's called. They're books, the Yerusha Seinu books in Bnei Brak. So I made a mistake. So I was looking it up. I was very, I wanted to see where this mistake came from. So I started reading up about the Shaagas Aryeh. So I said, hey, you know what? Maybe I should do an episode about the Shaagas Aryeh, his life and times. He was really an interesting person. And when I started digging into it, so I ended up in his last rabbinical position in Metz, the city of Metz in France. And I said, you know what? The city of Metz is much more interesting than the Shaagas Aryeh, so let me do on the Jewish community of Metz, and we'll have to wait for the Shaagas Aryeh for another time. So this episode has been a work in progress, and I'll focus on the story of Metz, and I'll digress to the Shaagas Aryeh when appropriate, and maybe one day we'll get back to the Shaagas Aryeh another time. So the Metz Jewish community, today, the city of Metz is located in France, as it was for, I think, the overwhelming majority of its history. It did cross the border a few times into Germany, which we'll discuss. It is east. It's near the German border, obviously, east of Paris, we'd call it central or even towards the north of France. And it is an area that's referred to as Lorraine, or the larger area is two districts called Alsace-Lorraine. I'm probably mispronouncing both words because I don't think there's ever been a French word that I've ever pronounced correctly, but Alsace-Lorraine, those two areas. So Metz is in the Lorraine section, and these two regions were contested territory between Germany and France for over 1,000 years, and it passed hands. The political history of the area is fascinating because since it passed hands between France and Germany so many times, so there's a lot of cultural and all kinds of other influence because it was controlled at different times by Germany and France, and it was the cause of many wars, and very, very interesting, and it has a lot of impact on the Jewish history there as well. Now, I want to say in general, France in general and Alsace-Lorraine in particular, there's lots of potential for Jewish history trips. I have never had a group yet that wanted a trip there. There is one that might do it this spring. They're still discussing it, but I have never yet done it. I would love to. There's a lot of potential, a lot of Jewish history, a lot of things still standing, shuls and cemeteries and kivrei tzaddikim and all kinds of other things. It's really, really interesting, a lot of rich history. We got to have groups starting to do France, and it's underrated. There's lots to see there, so hopefully we'll get that going as well. The Metz Jewish history is divided into two time periods. One I'll mention just briefly. That's the early time period. It's during this time period which we often refer to as the era of the Rishonim, or medieval Europe. In Metz was in the general area of Ashkenaz, which was eastern central France of today, and the southern Rhine River Valley in southwestern Germany of today. That's the area of Ashkenaz, and it flourished as Ashkenaz. Today, as I mentioned, it's part of Lorraine, and part of the larger Alsace-Lorraine region, which was always in dispute between France and Germany. Actually, earlier on, it wasn't Germany, it was the Holy Roman Empire during those early times. So Metz, like all Jewish communities of this region during this time, was a center of the Balei Tosfos. Jews settled in Metz at least from the 9th century, perhaps earlier, and it flourished in the 11th through the 13th centuries. So for about 300-400 years, it was a very prominent Jewish community during the time of the Rishonim, during the time of the Balei Tosfos. It definitely suffered from the general challenges of medieval Ashkenaz, such as the First Crusade, where many were killed, pogroms and expulsions and discrimination, etc. But it still had a glorious era, most famously under the leadership of Rabbi Eliezer of Metz. Rabbi Eliezer Mintz, he's the author of the Sefer Yereim, but there were also several other generations of Balei Tosfos who resided and were the rabbis of the city of Metz during this time. Now, within the context of the many expulsions which Jews of Europe endured during the medieval period, the Jews of Metz and the district were permanently expelled in 1365. So in 1365, it effectively ends Jewish life there completely for 200 years. So the early time period, which I said, like I'm mentioning only briefly, is until the year 1365, and then it ends, a sudden end with an expulsion. No more Jews in that area. So then we have the revival of Jewish life in Metz, and this is chapter 2. This is already the second round of Metz Jewish history, and it takes place in the mid-16th century. What happens is that France conquers the area of Alsace-Lorraine from the Holy Roman Empire, and the French kingdom, monarchy, decides to create this area of Metz as a buffer zone, to fortify it with a strong military presence, a permanent garrison. Fortresses till today are still a tourist attraction in the city of Metz and in the area. These are medieval fortresses built at this time. And in order to supply the military that was now there, the French decided that they require merchants and importers to live in the area, to drum up business, to bring in, grain and food trade. So Jews are merchants and do these types of business. So a couple of Jewish families were invited by the government to settle in Metz for the first time in 2 centuries. So it was just about 4 families. A few years later, the Jewish settlement there was formally legalized. The Jewish population grows slowly and gradually from the mid-1500s to the mid-1600s. So the first 100 years of the renewal of the Jewish community in Metz is kind of uneventful. It's the it germinates. It's the beginning of the Jewish community, a renewal of the Jewish community. It was relatively small. It wasn't yet prominent. It was just getting started. Again, it was just a couple of hundred Jews, and there were some draconian anti-Semitic discriminatory measures against the Jewish population in place. There was a requirement to wear a special hat. This is, again, in the late 1500s, early 1600s. There was high discriminatory taxes. There was limits on which commercial operations they were allowed to engage in. All rabbinical hirees had to be approved by the government. It was restricted where they were permitted to reside in the city. They had to kind of like live in a ghetto, and several other restrictions. So Metz Jewry did not view themselves as a renewal or a continuation of the medieval Jewish Metz. They saw themselves as a completely new entity. Interestingly enough, they also didn't see themselves as traditionally related to the Jews of Alsace either. The Jews of Metz, in this renewal of the late 1500s of the new Jewish community in Metz, they actually saw themselves as sort of an extension of German Ashkenaz Jewry of the Frankfurt Lower Rhine River Valley area. It's not actually far away geographically or culturally, and that's the shape the community took with their customs and all that. It was a very German-like Ashkenaz community. It was Yiddish-speaking community until around the time of the French Revolution in 1789. By the mid-1600s, it was still quite small, but it was on the cusp of experiencing a golden age. The golden age of Metz Jewry was to last from the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War and solidified French control over Alsace-Lorraine, until the French Revolution in 1789. So that's how we cap the golden age of Metz Jewry, 1648 to 1789. The Peace of Westphalia until the French Revolution. That's a period of almost 150 years, just short of 150 years. So the factors which contributed to this experiencing the golden age in Metz was the Peace of Westphalia itself, which both brought an end to this horrible 30 Years' War, which was, a religious war between the Catholics and the Protestants, among other things. There was a lot of other things going on in the 30 Years' War, but this is not a history of the 30 Years' War. But an end to war is always better. It was always, as well, in addition, the Peace of Westphalia put the region firmly under French control, which meant political stability. Political stability is always good for the flourishing of a Jewish community. The rights of the Jews to reside in the area were expanded and formalized. The region experienced an economic boom, and many Jews of Metz rode that wave and became quite wealthy, which meant that the Metz Jewish community was one of the richest in Europe, in fact, very wealthy upper class. That in turn meant that due to the immigration from the Polish kingdom to the east during this time, why? Because it was following the terrible pogroms of Tach V'Tat. We just mentioned that this 1648, which is the Peace of Westphalia in the east, there's a different event that takes place in 1648. That's the Chmielnicki massacres, the Tach V'Tat massacres of 1648 and 1649. So now there's migration from Poland east, and one of the attractive places to settle is Metz. So there's a rise of the prestige and size of the Metz Jewish community during this time. I always have noted to groups and in other forums that the Peace of Westphalia was signed in the exact same year as the Chmielnicki massacres of Tach V'Tat, as if Hashem was preparing Western Europe once again for Jewish migration, just as it was beginning to take a downturn in Eastern Europe. So it's very interesting that it was the same exact year. Either way, Metz was a destination for some of these migrants from Eastern Europe, which further contributed to the demographic growth of the Metz Jewish community. Coupled with their newfound financial status in Metz, it also meant that the leadership of the community was able to afford to entice prestigious rabbis from Eastern Europe to come serve at the helm of the Metz rabbinate with a large salary. It meant that the Bezdin, the rabbinical court of Metz, was prestigious in the area, had a big impact in the area because they were able to hire prominent dayanim. It meant that the wealth of the community also meant that they were able to support a prestigious yeshiva in Metz, because this is the age of the Kahal yeshiva. So it's the local yeshiva, but it's supported by the Kahal. The Kahal is wealthy. It means it's more prestigious. Bigger Rosh Yeshiva, who was always basically always the rabbi of the community, was the Rosh Yeshiva. And It meant that it was able to grow in size because they were able to afford to host more students. And the prestigious yeshiva in Metz lasted until the French Revolution. It attracted an international student body from Poland and Germany, in addition to the local students. In its last years of the yeshiva, when the Shaagas Aryeh was the rabbi of Metz during the late 1700s, it had over 60 students from Poland. Now, considering this was under the old Kehila model of a yeshiva, where the funding was all local, and hence most yeshivas at that time were relatively quite small, maybe 10, 20 students. So this is a very impressive number indeed, because this is 60 students just from Poland, besides for all the local students and also some from Germany. So this is a very large yeshiva at the time, relatively. In the last decade of the 17th century, the 1690s, out of concern that the growing wealth of the financial elite in Metz would lead to two issues. The two issues were, one, there was concern that it would lead to two issues. So the number one issue was that there would be jealousy from non-Jewish merchants who weren't as well off. And number two, the government would notice the wealth of the Jewish community and therefore raise taxes. So the parnasim, the leaders of the community, who were always from the financial elite of the Kahal, they promulgated a series of takanas, bylaws, rules, which limited how one was permitted to flaunt their wealth in public. There was no limit in how much wealth and assets you were allowed to have. Only the takanas were how you were able to publicize it, to flaunt it in public. Detailed rules regarding jewelry for men and women, clothing, events, properties. It's actually fascinating. I mean, the entire Pinkus of Metz is survived, and it's been researched by the premier researcher of Metz Jewry specifically and French Jewry in general, Professor J. Berkowitz, who's written several excellent books on the subjects of French Jewry and Metz Jewry. He's a leading scholar in the field, so he has a whole study of the Pinkus of Metz itself. In any event, so Professor Berkowitz also relates this series of takanas. Why was it specifically in the 1690s? What happened in the 1690s? What is the wider context? So it was directly related to the overall downturn in the French economy at the time and the result of the 9 Years' War, which was another war which was winding down at this time as well. So it's really interesting that because of the larger economic and war issues in France, so the Jewish community made these takanas not to flaunt their wealth. Very interesting. But it's also reflective of the economic success that Metz Jewry was enjoying during this time. It doesn't mean everyone, by the way. It means there was a financial elite. It means there was also a middle class and also a lot of poor people in the community also. It doesn't mean that everyone was wealthy. By the turn of the 18th century, Metz had established itself as one of the wealthiest and one of the most important Torah centers in all of Europe. They had a large yeshiva, an influential bezdin, and very impressive rabbis on their roster. And it was a very religious and scholarly kehillah. In 1700, a wealthy widow named Glickel of Hamelin moved to Metz, where she remained for the rest of her life. She wrote a long and detailed memoir, and it's one of the most unique and important chronicles we have on historical record from that time period, especially written by a woman in Yiddish originally. It's been translated to English, Hebrew, and other languages. The details that she writes are personal details, intimate details, but also about the community, about the Jewish world at the time. It's really one of the most important contributions of Jewish memoir literature ever written. It's an amazing book. I mean, it's very famous. I'm sure most of listeners have heard of it, but you definitely should read it, or if it's too long to read, it's quite long, you'd read a summary of it. It's a fascinating account. In any event, Glickel, who arrives in Metz and settles down there, she describes at length the Jewish communal life in Metz during her day. She describes the intense religious life. She says how she personally experienced the religious life there. She writes about a fire that took place in the shul and how some people died and leaving the fire, and it was actually not from the fire itself, but from trampling as they left the exit. Very tragic story. Many other events, some are mundane, some were special and unique, but all from Jewish Metz during this time, when Metz was at the peak of its golden age. So we have actually a nice historical first-hand account during this time. The size of the Metz Jewish community during the early 1700s wasn't all that huge. It was probably 1,500, 2,000, maybe 2,500 towards the end of the 1700s. but it was about quality, not so much about quantity. And truth be told, 2,000 Jews was considered a relatively large Jewish community in the 1700s, even though that's hard to believe. But the 1700s is before the huge demographic growth of the 19th century, so 2,000 Jews was still a relatively large Jewish community. There are two trends which were salient features of Metz Jewish life through the 18th century. The first trend was the wealthy elite who ran the kahal slowly assumed more and more responsibility for running the kehillah at the expense of the power of the rabbinate. In other words, the parnasim, the kahal, the wealthy balabatim, they slowly took away the power from the rabbis of Metz. During the Golden Age, when they had the most important and prestigious rabbis in the world. I'll talk about them soon. But the kahal, they slowly assumed more and more responsibilities and powers for the kahal away from the rabbinate. That was one trend that took place over the 1700s, an interesting trend. The second trend that's noticeable in Metz over the 1700s is a gradual modernization and loosening of traditional observance, which might be related to the first point. This was among Metz's Jews in general, but especially the wealthy ones over the decades. In fact, the Glickl of Hamlin notes that in her memoirs, that from her arrival to the time that she's penning her memoirs, which is 20 some odd years later, she's noticed a considerable lessening of religious observance and a growing preference for speaking French over Yiddish. Now, why is this information so crucial, so important, and so overlooked? Because this trend, or these last two trends, especially the second one, is decades before the French Revolution and emancipation of French Jewry, equal rights and citizenship. It's long before the French Revolution and emancipation. We're talking about the early to mid 1700s. The French Revolution is in 1789. Emancipation is 2 years later in 1791. So it's astounding. Not only that, but it's in a city and a country that never had reform or haskalah. Reform or haskalah was never in France. So here's a country that never had reform or haskalah, not then, not later. And it's before the French Revolution and emancipation, and yet there's this gradual modernization and loosening of traditional observance among Metz's Jews. That's a general trend of modernity. And the French Revolution just exacerbated an existing trend and eventually leads to the secularization of the Jewish community of France in general, and Metz specifically, over the 19th century, which we'll see soon, that is independent of any reform or haskalah. So lo and behold, in the modern era, you can become secular without reform and haskalah, and you can also become secular, or at least more modernized and loosening of traditional observance, even without the French Revolution and emancipation, just because of the modern era. Amazing. As I said in previous episodes, this is a topic we'll get back to eventually and elaborate on, because this is an earth-shattering chiddush for many, I'm assuming. So the last great rabbi of Metz's golden age, before the French Revolution, was the Shaagas Aryeh, who passed away in 1785, just 4 years before the French Revolution. And he himself expressed his disappointment on the diminishing number of Torah scholars, or even those who study Torah. He said the Loimdei Torah are less in Metz during his tenure, but yet he still viewed it as one of the most prestigious Jewish communities in Europe. It was still relatively in a good place. On that note, it's worth mentioning a funny story with the Shaagas Aryeh and his arrival in Metz in 1766. He served in Metz in the last 20 years of his life, from when he was 70 to 90. He passed away at a very old age for that time. The Metz community custom on Shavuos morning, which was based on a ruling of a previous rabbi of Metz, Rav Yaakov Reischer, the Shavuos Yaakov, who served as rabbi there several decades earlier, was to recite the Akdamus Piyut following the bracha of the Kohen on the Torah on Shavuos morning. Shaagas Aryeh was adamant that it be recited prior to the blessing of the Kohen on the Torah, so that it would not constitute a hefsek. It has to be before the bracha on the Torah and not after a bracha on the Torah, as was the custom. So the community was in an uproar. They were horrified that the new rabbi would dare change a holy custom of the community, which was inscribed in the official Pinkas Hakal. It was an official ledger. It was inscribed that this was the custom. So how dare a new rabbi come along and change this custom? A long dispute ensued because of this. And in the end, an uneasy peace was settled. The Shaagas Aryeh did not get along after this with most of the community leadership. He even wanted to leave, but they had already submitted his candidacy to the government for approval, and they were not able to get it back. So once the government approved it, he had to be the rabbi. But it was never comfortable after that, and the Shaagas Aryeh discontinued davening in the main shul. He davened in another smaller shtibel for the rest of his tenure there, except on several Shabbosim a year, where his rabbinical contract stipulated that he deliver a speech to the community from the pulpit of the main shul. That's the only times he davened in the main shul for the rest of his life. That's all fact. Of course, legend adds another layer to this story to make it more exciting. It's probably apocryphal. When the dust settled, the community leadership brings that very same Pinkas Hakal, that community ledger, to the Shaagas Aryeh for him to add something, because the custom was each incoming rabbi adds something to the communal ledger, some sort of custom to that the community should take upon themselves. So the Shaagas Aryeh, very cynically, according to this apocryphal story, he said, why don't you inscribe the Aseres HaDibros, the 10 Commandments, into the Pinkas Hakal? I see how particular the Metz community is in not violating anything written in the community ledger, as I saw from the whole dispute about Akdamas, so why not add the Aseres HaDibros? Parenthetically, once we brought up the Shaagas Aryeh, the Shaagas Aryeh was never known as the Shaagas Aryeh. For the majority of his life, he was known as Reb Leib Rosh Yeshiva. He grew up in a rabbinical family in the Minsk area, and he was a Rosh Yeshiva in Minsk for many years. He was known as Reb Leib Rosh Yeshiva. In fact, he had to leave Minsk due to a dispute with Minsk's legendary rabbi, Rav Yechiel Halperin, the author of the Seder HaDoros, which is a history book. Actually, when he was leaving, because of this dispute, so he was leaving Minsk, there was a lady, a woman who came over to him, and she said, here, take at least food for Shabbos, and she gave him some things, and some food, and some drinks, and whatever it was. And he was very grateful to her, so he gave her a blessing. He said, may you become very wealthy, and support Torah your entire life and live a long life. And she became very wealthy, and she became the patron of a prominent Minsk yeshiva, which eventually came to be named for this woman, called Blumka's Klois. And Blumka's Klois was one of the most, there were several yeshivas in Minsk, and Blumka's Klois was probably the most prominent, and it lasted until the Bolshevik Revolution. It was around there. So that's a story related to the Shaagas Aryeh. So the Shaagas Aryeh left Minsk, and he was later a Malamed, a teacher of school children in a small shtetl. He later also assisted his father, who was getting old, with his rabbinical responsibilities. And he served for 2 stints as rabbi in Volozhin, 2 different times. He left Volozhin, then he came back to Volozhin. And during his second stint as rabbi of Volozhin, he was a rebbe of Reb Chaim Volozhin. Reb Chaim Volozhiner was his student, who was a young teenager in Minsk, and he was the student of the Shaagas Aryeh. There's a lot to say about his life in Volozhin and rabbinate in other places. The Shaagas Aryeh later wandered around Europe for a while, partly because of a self-imposed exile, which many tzaddikim did throughout Jewish history. And he also spent time in Frankfurt an der Oder, which is not Frankfurt an der Main in Western Germany, which we usually talk about. Frankfurt an der Oder, which is on the Oder River in Eastern Germany, south of Berlin. And he also spent time in Berlin, where when he was printing, he was printing his Shaagas Aryeh, his Sefer Shaagas Aryeh, in Frankfurt an der Oder. And during the printing, he spent time in that city and also in Berlin. Later, the Turei Even he printed. I think that was in a different city later on in life. By the way, a lot of the Shaagas Aryeh was poor most of his life. He was not able to print all of his Sfarim. A lot of his writings remained in manuscript. And one of the ones who redeemed the manuscript and oversaw the first time ever publishing of some of the Shaagas Aryeh's writings was no less than the Chavetz Chaim himself. I'm not sure how many people are aware of that. The Chavetz Chaim went ahead and published some of the unpublished manuscripts of the Shaagas Aryeh and other Masechtas, and it's entitled Gvuras Ari. That's published by the Chavetz Chaim, interestingly enough. Most of his life, the Shaagas Aryeh lived in poverty, and he was hired to the rabbinate of Metz when he was 70 years old, already quite old. He finally lived well off in his old age with a good salary in Metz, but the community was concerned about his age. So in his rabbinical contract, they actually stipulated a clause in the contract. I don't know how the Shaagas Aryeh could guarantee this, but he did, that he would serve as rabbi for at least 12 years. So the Shaagas Aryeh then got up at the pulpit, and his first time he spoke in Metz, and he guaranteed more than that. He said, I'm going to serve as rabbi here longer than the 17 years that Yaakov Avinu was in Egypt. And he served for 20 years, and he passed away at the age of 90, which was an extremely old age in 1785. Lots to say about the Shaagas Aryeh. Like I said, we'll have to save for another time. Getting back to Metz, even during this golden age, medieval anti-Semitism unfortunately did not disappear. In 1669, there was a terrible blood libel. A resident of Metz was accused of ritual murder, a baseless charge, obviously. But despite all the evidence to the contrary, he was convicted and burned at the stake. Terrible tragedy. The Jews of Metz were going to get expelled. They were going to have an expulsion edict. But this decree was rescinded at the last second and averted. So that day that this person was killed was observed as a fast day, actually, by Metz Jewry until the Holocaust. The French Revolution in 1789 led to the emancipation of French Jewry, and specifically of the Jews of Alsace-Lorraine in 1791, 2 years after the Revolution. So Metz Jewry becomes more French, they become more modern, and they continue the previous trends of modernization, which had been evident already for decades. That was more gradual. No one became secular overnight. That just didn't happen. There was a major dramatic change, though. The major dramatic change in Jewish life of Metz, occurred as a result of the reign of terror in the aftermath of the French Revolution. This was an extremely, among other things, the reign of terror was also very anti-clerical, anti-religious government. Now, they're anti-religion, is the age of reason, the age of the Enlightenment, the age of science. They're tearing down all religious symbols of the old Catholic French, because the church was a symbol of the old France and the monarchy together with the church. And this was the revolution, the liberty and the brotherhood and the humanity of the. So it was very anti-religious. So the primary enemy during the reign of terror was the Catholic Church and the aristocracy. However, because they were so vehemently anti-religious, so eventually all religions and religious symbols and institutions suffered as a result. So in Alsace-Lorraine, including in Metz, shuls were shut. The famous yeshiva of Metz was closed. Many of the Torah leaders and their students simply moved to Germany because it didn't seem sustainable. Most of them never to return. So this resulted in a serious religious downturn of the community. And although after the reign of terror ended, which was just a few years, the shul was returned to the Jewish community and it resumed activity and it opened again at the end of the reign of terror, but it would never be the same. Metz Jewry would never be the same after that. This is followed by the Napoleonic era. Representatives from Metz, Rabbanim from Metz, attended Napoleon's Sanhedrin in 1808. By this point, and well into the 19th century, until the mid-19th century at least, Metz represented the most religious, or conservative, we'll call it, flank of a ever the more secularized French Jewry. So despite the fact that Metz was undergoing its own modernization and eventually secularization, but Metz remained much more traditional than the rest of France. In fact, they were like the last real religious holdout in France. Very interesting. A rabbinical seminary opened in Metz in the 1830s, next to the reopened yeshiva. But this rabbinical seminary was already a rabbinical seminary. It included all sorts of subjects. Other than Torah and Halacha, much of the teaching was in French, not in Yiddish. It was less traditional. It soon moved to Paris, where it modernized even more. I'm pretty sure this rabbinical seminary still exists today in Paris. In 1850, the new massive shul of Metz was dedicated. The community is flourishing. It's less religious. It's less traditional, but it's flourishing. That shul, which is still Orthodox, again, there's no reform in Metz, so whatever religion is, it's Orthodox. Is still standing, and it's still in use by the current Jewish community of Metz, and it's still Orthodox till today, till 2024, as I last checked. The next major story in the history of Jewish Metz is the outcome of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871. Why? Because Alsace-Lorraine returns to German control under Bismarck's United German Empire when Prussia was victorious over France in the Franco-Prussian War. Now, this posed some challenges for Metz Jewry. They're in Lorraine, of course, so now they return to Germany. They're now back in Germany. In religious custom and culture, Metz had for centuries, like I mentioned earlier, had considered themselves part of the old Ashkenaz German Jewry. But yet, since the French Revolution, they were very big French patriots, even the religious Jews. Quite outspoken, as a matter of fact. They adopted French norms, French culture, French language, and now they found themselves in Germany. So the community Germanized rather quickly. That's because many Jews who felt that their identity was French, they simply left and moved to France. So a large number of Jews from Metz, after the Franco-Prussian War, they said, we're French. We can't stay in Germany. We're French. We feel French. So we're going to leave our home, leave our community. They moved to Paris, mostly to Paris and other places in France. They left. Very interesting. It says a lot about the success of the revolution, or whatever, the reality of the revolution and its results. I don't know if you want to call that success or not. In any event, this weakened the community further on one hand, but on the other hand, there was some migration of German Jews to Metz now that it was in Germany. Rabbis now sometimes said their speeches from the pulpit in the shuls alternating between French and German. So there's a lot of confusion. In 1902, the German government seized the property of the ancient Jewish cemetery because they wanted to use that area for fortifications of the city. The Jews of Metz were forced to dig up all of the ancient graves, including all of the graves of the illustrious tzaddikim who served in the Metz rabbinate over the centuries, including the Shaagas Aryeh and many others, and transfer the bones en masse to the new Jewish cemetery where they were placed in a mass grave. They remain in that mass grave that way until today. A plaque next to the mass grave in the new cemetery today lists all of the famous rabbis who are among those buried in this mass grave in the transfer from the old cemetery. The next trend, which commenced in the late 19th century and continued well into the 20th century, the 1930s, was a great influx of Eastern European Jews to Western Europe, a massive influx all over Western Europe, and this included into Metz. Thousands of Eastern European Jews settled in Metz. They didn't really integrate into the official Jewish community. They sort of established their own. This was kind of like an Eastern European Jewish community, which was in Metz alongside the established Metz Jewish communities. There's kind of two different distinct communities at this point. Now, each one had their secular and had their religious, right? Not everyone's religious at this point, obviously. We're in the late 19th, early 20th century. So there was actually lots of animosity between the two communities. I mean, the native Metz French Jewish community, French Ashkenaz Jewish community, and the newcomers from Eastern Europe. A lot of animosity. They had very little to do with each other. Some were more religious than others. There was actually a Hasidic community of Galician and Polish Jews that established in a community called Adas Yereim. They had their own shul, their own institutions and schools. So in a demographic sense, the old Metz community shrunk significantly during this time, but the absolute size of the Jewish community grew to its largest extent ever due to the recent immigration of Eastern European Jews. It was over 4,000 Jews in the early 1900s. Each community had their own rabbi and institutions, but the majority by this point were secular, as I mentioned. Now, following World War I, we switch back. Alsace-Lorraine returns to French rule under the Treaty of Versailles, and it remains part of France until today. But lots of German architecture and culture and remnants of centuries of German rule remain visible in the city and in the Jewish community. Now, following the fall of France in World War II, in June 1940, Nazi Germany occupies France. Most Jews of Alsace-Lorraine, which included Metz, obviously, escaped to the south in order to be in Vichy France, which was not under direct Nazi occupation. It was a French collaborationist regime with the Nazis. Now, it was incorrectly perceived as safer by the Jews of Metz and other places. It was actually a collaborationist regime and wasn't that much safer. Most of the Eastern European Jewish immigrant community did not have French citizenship, and therefore they were the first to be deported to Auschwitz in 1942 and 1943, unfortunately. And many French Jews followed, unfortunately, in 1943, 44. Eventually, about 1,500 Jews from Metz were killed during the Holocaust. But survivors returned, and some new survivors settled back in their old homes. The shul buildings survived and were restored. The community thrived again. It actually supports another theory that we say about that most of the reason that Jews did not settle back in their homes in Eastern Europe was more due to the communist takeover Eastern Europe, which did not allow Jewish life to be sustained in a normal sense, in a communal sense, and less so to do with the fact that Holocaust survivors were not comfortable returning to their homes, because you see, like places in France, they were quite comfortable returning to their homes. So the shul buildings survived and were restored. The community thrived again. It actually grew with the addition of a third community in the 1960s and 70s, North African Jews from Algeria and Morocco, with the collapse of the French colonies there. So now there are 3 Jewish communities in Metz: the original Ashkenaz French Jewish community, the Eastern European Haimish Hasidic community, and the Sephardic Moroccan Algerian community. Each one had their own shul. By the 1970s, there were over 3,000 Jews in Metz. Till today, there's an active Jewish and Orthodox Jewish community with 3 active shuls, schools, kashrus, mikveh, erev, whatever you want. A very flourishing Jewish community in Metz today, probably about 2,000 Jews or more. In general, it's worth noting that France has the 3rd largest Jewish community in the world, after the United States and Israel. It's larger than Canada or England. I want to mention briefly one more topic on Metz, which should be quite of interest to the listeners of Jewish History Soundbites, and that's some of the prominent and famous rabbis who served in Metz during the Golden Age. We don't know much about the rabbis who served there from the time Jews were permitted to return to Metz in the mid-1500s for the first century afterwards. But starting in 1649, we have a pretty impressive record. What makes it more interesting is that pretty early on, the Metz community leadership made the decision to never hire local talent and always import their rabbis. Although occasionally they brought them in from Germany, predominantly their imports were from Eastern Europe. The first prominent one was Rav Moshe Yirmiyahu HaKohen Katz, a student of the Marsha from Narol in Galicia. His son was the famous doctor, the Maisa Tuvia. He's quite prominent. Rav Moshe Yirmiyahu HaKohen Katz escaped from Poland during Tach V'Tat, during the 1648-1649 massacres in Poland, and he was appointed the rabbi of Metz. He incorporated a memorial prayer for Tach V'Tat as part of the Metz prayer service, even though it never took place in France. It took place in Poland, but he was a survivor, so he incorporated in. The next rabbi was Rabbi Yoina Ta'omim Frankel, the Kikoyan de Yoina, who also escaped Poland during Tach V'Tat. The next was Rabbi Gershon Ashkenazi, the Avodas HaGershuni, who left Vienna when its Jews were expelled. Rabbi Gavriel Oskels was the next one. He had previously been a rabbi in Krakow. He sort of gave up the rabbinate in Metz and moved to Vienna without really telling anybody. During his tenure in Metz, the yeshiva in Metz reached its peak prominence. Large, the wealthy of the community supported it. They built a building for it. It was referred to as the Metz Klois. When it seemed that Gavriel Oskels was not returning from Vienna to his town, so they hired a new rabbi. Metz was without a rabbi for a few years. In fact, Glickel of Hamlin, who lived in Metz during this time, she noted in her memoir that those years there was no official rabbinical leadership in Metz, and the community leaders sought to fill the vacuum. So they hired one of the greatest rabbis in the world of the 18th century, who unfortunately is not well remembered, Rabbi Avram Broide. He was later rabbi in Frankfurt. He was previously in Prague. He had a yeshiva in Prague. Some of his students at his Prague yeshiva, including his close student, Reb Nesanel Weil, the Korban Nesanel, moved with him to Metz, which added to the Metz yeshiva's prestige. The next successive rabbis in Metz were Reb Yaakov Reischer, the Shvus Yaakov, one of the biggest poskim in the world, who was previously rabbi of Worms, and he remained in Metz until his passing. Then Rabbi Yeshua Falk, the Pnei Yehoshua, before he moved to Frankfurt, was a rabbi in Metz, and succeeding the Pnei Yehoshua was Rav Yonasan Eybuschitz, who had been in Prague for quite some time before that, and later on he was in Hamburg for the rest of his life, but for nearly a decade in between Prague and Hamburg, he was the rabbi in Metz and had a huge impact on Torah life in the city through his leadership. Following Rav Yonasan Eybuschwitz's departure in 1750, Reb Shmuel Hillman, who had been the rabbi of Mannheim, which is not far away in Germany, was hired. He opened a printing press in Metz, which printed many Sfarim and added to the town's importance. Upon his passing in 1765, Reb Aryeh Leib, Reb Leib Rosh Yeshiva, the Shaagas Aryeh, was hired, and he remained until his passing in 1785. This was, like I said before, 4 years before the French Revolution, and the Shaagas Aryeh was the last of the great rabbis of Metz during its golden age. There was one more rabbi years later who was also very prominent, but he was an exception who proved the rule, Reb Aaron Verms. There were rabbis until the Holocaust, but they weren't of the same prominence as it was during its golden age. In fact, 2 out of the 3 last rabbis of Metz before the war were murdered in the Holocaust, unfortunately. The third one, who survived, Rav Nosson Nutter, rebuilt the community after the war when he returned. This was the history of Jewish Metz. This was Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, and trips all over. You can help the podcast out by telling your friends and family, leaving a review and a rating. I did hear from many listeners that there's been annoying advertising by Podbean lately in the podcast. I have no idea how this happened. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. I'm working on it. I'm very, very sorry. My apologies. And I hope to have it removed as soon as possible. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.